No one heard the screams, the little girl said, pointing to the locked basement. But when they open it, they find something unexpected. Please comment with what you thought of this story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and let me know which city you're watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story and get to know you better, so please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The oppressive July heat in Laurel Creek weighed on the downtown streets like a damp blanket, and Thomas Nelson adjusted his tie as he watched the activity from his 10th floor office window. At 42, the coffee tycoon had built an empire based on mistrust and absolute control, traits that had intensified after a traumatic divorce left him without custody of his daughter 3 years earlier. His graying temples and the expression lines etched on his face told the story of a man who had learned to trust no one. The meeting with the suppliers had been tense that morning. Bernard Campbell, his partner of 15 years, insisted on changes to the contracts that Thomas found suspicious. But he couldn't pinpoint exactly what bothered him. Nelson and Campbell Agribusiness controlled a large portion of the region's coffee production, and any decision impacted hundreds of families who depended on the company for their livelihood. It was 3 in the afternoon when Thomas went down to get documents from his car. Downtown was buzzing with the typical energy of a Carolina afternoon, shopkeepers reopening after lunch, students returning from classes, retirees chatting in the shaded town square. That's when he heard the crying. It wasn't the ordinary cry of a fussy or tired child. It was a desperate sound, heavy with an anguish, that made Thomas stop in the middle of the sidewalk. His eyes scanned the street until he found the source of the sound. A small girl, appearing to be about 4 years old, dirty and with torn clothes, was kneeling in front of the abandoned commercial building across the street. Thomas hesitated. For the past 3 years, he had developed an almost pathological aversion to children, as they always reminded him of Sophie, the daughter he had lost custody of in the divorce and who now lived in New York City with her mother. Every child's laugh was a stab. Every cry, a painful reminder of what he had lost. But this particular cry was different. The girl wasn't just crying, she was pointing insistently at the abandoned building, shouting words Thomas couldn't understand from a distance. Onlookers began to gather, but no one seemed to take the child seriously. Going against all his instincts, Thomas crossed the street. As he got closer, he could clearly hear what the girl was repeating between sobs. No one heard the screams. No one heard them. She's down there. The child was even smaller than he had imagined, with uncared-for curly hair and enormous tear-filled eyes. Her clothes were caked with dirt, and she smelled as if she hadn't bathed in days. When she saw Thomas approaching, she staggered to her feet and ran to him, clinging to his leg in desperation. "Mister, please, she's screaming down there. Nobody will listen." The words tumbled out, mixed with sobs. "There's a lady trapped downstairs." Thomas looked at the abandoned building. The 3-story structure had been a small shopping center in the 90s, but had been closed for at least 5 years. The windows were boarded up and rusted chains padlocked the main door. There was no way anyone could be inside. "Where are your parents, little one?" Thomas asked, trying to gently detach himself from the child's embrace. "I don't have a mommy or a daddy," she replied, wiping her nose on her t-shirt sleeve. "But there's a lady downstairs who's been screaming for a long time. I heard her." Some people who had stopped to watch the scene began to mutter among themselves. "It's that little homeless girl who wanders around," said an elderly woman, "always making up stories for attention." Others nodded in agreement and dispersed, losing interest. Thomas was about to do the same when the girl surprised him. With a strength impressive for her age, she pulled him toward the side alley of the building where there was a small iron door leading to the sub-basement. The door was slightly ajar, and a damp, unpleasant odor emanated from it. "Listen," the girl whispered, putting a finger to her lips. "Listen to the noises." Thomas bent down and paid attention. At first, he heard nothing but the sounds of traffic and conversations on the street. But then, very faint, almost imperceptible, a sound reached his ears that made his blood run. Cold, muffled groans coming from the depths of the building. Without a second thought, Thomas pushed the iron door. It creaked as it swung fully open, revealing a concrete staircase descending into total darkness. The air rising from the basement was cold and heavy with moisture, with a musty smell that made his eyes water. "Is anyone there?" Thomas shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. The response came immediately, a female voice, weak but desperate, crying for help. Thomas asked a few onlookers to call the fire department and turned on his phone's flashlight before descending the slippery steps. The basement was a maze of small rooms that had likely served as storage when the building was operational. The voice was coming from one of the rooms at the back, where Thomas found a scene that shocked him. A young woman, about 28 years old, was huddled in a corner, visibly dehydrated and in a state of shock. "It's okay. I'm getting you out of here," Thomas said, kneeling beside her. The woman looked up, and he could see the relief mixed with terror in her eyes. "I'm Iris," she whispered in a hoarse voice. "I've been here for 2 days. I thought no one would ever find me." As he helped Iris to her feet, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the little girl outside. How had she known someone was trapped there? How had she heard screams that no one else could detect? And most importantly, who was this child who seemed to know secrets that even adults couldn't uncover? When they finally emerged from the basement, the little girl was still there, waiting patiently on the sidewalk. Seeing Iris being rescued, her eyes shone with a satisfaction that seemed disproportionate for her age. It was at that moment that Thomas realized something much more complex was happening than a simple accidental rescue. The Laurel Creek Regional Hospital was buzzing with the typical activity of a Friday afternoon. Thomas walked through the white corridors beside Iris, who had insisted on being discharged after only a few hours of observation, despite the medical staff's protests. The young teacher was still trembling slightly, a consequence of the psychological trauma of spending 2 days locked in the dark, damp basement. "I can't understand how that little girl knew I was there," Iris murmured for the 3rd time, adjusting the borrowed jacket a nurse had found for her. Her brown hair was tied back in a makeshift ponytail, and there were dark circles under her green eyes. "I swear I heard other people walk past the alley, but no one else stopped to listen." Thomas didn't answer immediately. Since they had left the abandoned building, a strange unease had consumed him. The girl had simply vanished when the firefighters arrived, dissolving into the crowd of onlookers as if she had never existed. But her image remained vivid in his mind, those enormous eyes filled with a wisdom that didn't match her apparent age. "Are you sure you don't know her?" Thomas insisted, stopping near the hospital exit. "She seemed very determined to find me specifically." Iris shook her head, wincing slightly as the movement made her vision blur for a moment. The doctor had warned of possible dizzy spells due to dehydration, but she refused to be admitted. She had responsibilities that couldn't wait. "I've never seen her before, but—" Iris paused, frowning as if trying to grasp a fragmented memory. There was something familiar about her. Maybe it's just the trauma confusing me, but I swear I've seen those eyes somewhere before. Thomas studied the teacher's face. Iris Miller was different from the women he usually associated with in his business circles. There was a brutal honesty in her expression, a complete lack of artifice that made him uncomfortable. He was used to people who always wanted something from him, who calculated every word and gesture. But Iris seemed genuinely grateful, with no hidden agendas. "Can I take you home?" he offered, surprising himself with his own initiative. For the past 3 years, he had avoided any personal involvement beyond what was strictly necessary. "You don't have to bother," Iris replied quickly, but Thomas noticed the hesitation in her voice. "I live in Hope's Crossing. It's far from downtown." Thomas knew the neighborhood. Hope's Crossing was on the outskirts of Laurel Creek, a region of modest houses primarily inhabited by public servants, factory workers, and small business owners. It was the kind of place he drove through without ever stopping, a world completely different from his downtown apartment. "I insist," he said, and this time there was a firmness in his voice that brooked no refusal. The drive to Hope's Crossing was made in relative silence, broken only by the occasional directions Iris gave. Thomas drove his SUV through the narrow streets, observing the simple but well-kept houses, the children playing on the sidewalk, the elderly women chatting at their gates. It was like entering a parallel world, where corporate problems and business betrayals seemed like issues from another planet. "It's there," Iris said, pointing to a small light blue house with a tiny front garden where begonias and basil grew. "I live with my mother, Mrs. Celia." When they pulled up in front of the house, a woman of about 55 appeared at the door. Mrs. Celia was visibly thinner than she should be, with sunken eyes that denoted constant worry and calloused hands from hard work. Seeing her daughter get out of a luxury car, her expression was a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Iris, my daughter, where were you? You didn't come home last night. You didn't answer your phone." Mrs. Celia's words came in a rush as she hugged her daughter tightly. "There was a problem, Mum, but everything's okay now," Iris said, returning the hug. "This is Mr. Nelson. He helped me." Thomas got out of the car and greeted Mrs. Celia with a respectful nod. The woman observed him with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude, clearly wondering how an obviously wealthy man had gotten involved in her daughter's life. "Thank you so much for helping my Iris," Mrs. Celia said, discreetly wiping away a tear. "She's a teacher, you know, always worrying more about others than herself." It was then that Thomas noticed something that made him shudder internally. In the window of the house next door, a curtain moved slightly, revealing for an instant a familiar face, the curly-haired girl who had insisted he investigate the abandoned building. She was watching the scene with an intensity that made Thomas feel like he was being studied. "Iris," he said quietly, lightly touching the teacher's arm. "The girl who helped us today, does she live around here?" Iris followed Thomas's gaze to the window, but the curtain had already fallen back into place. "What girl?" she asked, confused. "The one who was crying in front of the building, the one who led me to you." Iris frowned, and Thomas realized she genuinely didn't remember the child. The trauma, he concluded, the shock of being trapped had affected her memories of the rescue. "I don't remember any girl," she said hesitantly. "I remember you finding me, the firefighters arriving, but..." At that moment, Mrs. Celia interjected, "It must be little Jasmine. She showed up in the neighborhood a few months ago, poor thing. They say her mother is very sick in the public hospital. The girl just wanders the streets, looking for anyone who can help." The name echoed in Thomas's mind like a distant bell. Jasmine. Why did that name seem familiar? And why had the girl chosen him specifically to ask for help? "Her mother. Do you know her name?" Thomas asked, a strange intuition growing in his chest. "Constance, I think," Mrs. Celia replied, scratching her head. "Constance Santos. She worked as a nurse at the hospital until she got sick. Now poor Jasmine is all alone, with no one to properly care for her." Thomas's world seemed to spin for a moment. Constance Santos, he knew that name. Constance had worked at his company a few years ago, not as a nurse but in the administrative department, a kind, efficient woman who had resigned abruptly about 2 years ago with no clear explanation. Bernard had handled the paperwork, saying she had found a better job in another city. "Mr. Nelson, are you all right?" Iris's voice sounded distant, as if coming from far away. Thomas blinked, returning to the present. Yes, sorry. It's just, I knew a Constance Santos a few years ago. She worked at my company. What a coincidence, Mrs. Celia commented, but her eyes revealed she had noticed the sudden change in Thomas's demeanor. It's a small world. As he said his goodbyes to the family and returned to his car, Thomas couldn't stop thinking. If Constance Santos was indeed his former employee, it meant that Jasmine hadn't found him. By chance. Somehow, the girl knew who he was. But how? And why had she chosen that exact day, that exact moment, to ask for his help? Driving back downtown, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. The next day, he would go to the public hospital to look for Constance Santos. He needed answers to the questions that were beginning to multiply in his mind, like pieces of a complex and disturbing puzzle. What he didn't know was that Jasmine was watching him from the window of an empty house in Hope's Crossing, her eyes shining with a satisfaction that seemed to hold secrets even adults couldn't comprehend. The public hospital in Laurel Creek contrasted sharply with the private clinic where Thomas usually had his annual checkups. Overcrowded hallways, the strong smell of disinfectant mixed with something he preferred not to identify, and a general atmosphere of exhaustion that permeated both staff and patients. He had arrived there on Saturday morning with a determination that was beginning to waver in the face of the raw reality of that environment. Constance Santos, the nurse at the front desk repeated, checking a handwritten list in a worn-out notebook. Ward C, room 247, but she's in very delicate condition, sir. Visits are restricted to family. I was her employer, Thomas lied, surprised at how easily the lie came out. I'd like to help with her treatment costs. The nurse studied him for a moment, clearly weighing whether a well-dressed man like him would be a positive or problematic influence. Finally, she nodded. Ward C is on the second floor, but please don't agitate her. She can barely stay awake. The walk to room 247 was a journey through a scene Thomas had never imagined existed so close to his comfortable reality. Gurneys in the hallways with patients waiting hours for care, family members sleeping in plastic chairs, the constant beep of medical equipment mixed with whispered conversations and muffled sobs. When he finally found the room, Thomas hesitated at the half-open door. Through the crack, he could see a woman who was far too thin lying in the bed closest to the window, connected to several machines. It took him a few seconds to recognize Constance Santos, his former employee. The illness had drastically changed her features, but her kind eyes remained the same. "Constance?" he called softly, entering the room. The woman slowly opened her eyes, and Thomas saw the exact moment she recognized him. A mixture of surprise, fear, and something that looked like relief crossed her face before she tried to sit up. "Mr. Nelson." Her voice was a hoarse whisper. "What? How did you find me?" "Your daughter," he said simply, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Jasmine found me yesterday." The effect of her daughter's name on Constance was immediate and devastating. Tears began to roll down her thin cheeks as she tried to compose herself. "My Jasmine, where is she? I haven't seen her in days. The shelter said she ran away again." "She's fine," Thomas lied, though he wasn't sure. "But I need to understand some things, Constance. Why did you leave the company so suddenly? And why did you never contact me when you got sick?" Constance closed her eyes, and Thomas realized she was fighting an internal battle. When she finally spoke, her words were heavy with a weight he hadn't expected. "Because I found out things I shouldn't have," she whispered. "And because your partner, Mr. Campbell, told me it would be better for me to disappear before someone got hurt." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "What kind of things?" "The fake contracts, the doctored invoices, the money that vanished from the accounts." Constance opened her eyes and looked at him directly. I handled the auxiliary accounting, remember? I saw all the numbers. Mr. Campbell had been embezzling money from the company for years, but that wasn't all. He had partnerships with ghost suppliers, overcharging on school lunch contracts. School lunch contracts? Thomas sat up straighter. Our company doesn't have contracts with schools. Yes, it does, Mr. Nelson. Through Campbell Distributors, Mr. Campbell's brother-in-law's company. They use our invoices to launder the money from fraudulent bids. Constance coughed violently, and Thomas saw drops of blood on the handkerchief she brought to her mouth. Thomas's mind was racing. Bernard had always handled the more complex administrative side of the business, precisely because Thomas preferred to focus on production and direct sales. He had blindly trusted his partner, especially after the divorce, when he had almost completely withdrawn from daily operations. Why didn't you tell me this at the time, he asked, trying to keep his voice low despite his growing anger. Because he said you were involved, Constance replied, and the words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He said you knew everything, and that if I said anything I wouldn't just lose my job, I'd never be able to work anywhere again. And I had Jasmine to think about. The silence that followed was broken only by the beeping of medical equipment. Thomas felt a mixture of anger and guilt growing in his chest. Constance had been an exemplary employee, always punctual, always efficient. And he had allowed Bernard to intimidate and dismiss her without even questioning the reasons. And now, he finally asked, how have you been surviving? I sold candy on the street until I couldn't stand anymore, Constance said, her voice growing weaker. Jasmine helped me, poor thing. A 4-year-old child helping her sick mother sell candy. She started to cry again. When I collapsed on the street and they brought me here, they said it was advanced pneumonia, that I should have sought treatment months ago. But how? I had no money, no health insurance. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders like a stone. If he had questioned Constance's departure, if he had paid more attention to the business instead of isolating himself in his post-divorce bitterness, none of this would have happened. Constance, I'm going to fix this, he said, standing up from the chair. I'll take care of your treatment, and I'm going to find out exactly what Bernard has been doing. Mr. Nelson, she called as he reached the door. Be careful. Mr. Campbell, he's not the person you think he is. And if he finds out I talked to you, he won't find out, Thomas assured her, but there was a dangerous determination in his voice that made Constance worry even more. As he left the hospital, Thomas made 2 important calls. The first was to his lawyer, Robert Miles, scheduling an urgent meeting for Monday. The second was to a private clinic, requesting the immediate transfer of Constance Santos and authorizing all costs in his name. But there was one question that bothered him more than all the revelations of corruption. How had Jasmine known he could help? How had a 4-year-old child managed to find him at the exact moment her mother most needed rescue? The answer would come from an unexpected source. Arriving home that afternoon, he found a simple envelope under his door. No return address, just his name written in a childish hand. Inside was a crayon drawing of a little girl and a man in a suit holding hands, with words written in shaky letters. Thank you for helping Mommy, Jasmine. But it was what was on the back of the paper that made Thomas's blood run cold, an old, faded photograph showing himself next to a blonde girl of about 6. It was a photo he hadn't seen in 3 years, a photo that should have been stored only in his personal albums. It was a photo of him with Sophie, his daughter. How had Jasmine gotten that photo, and why did she want him to see it? The questions multiplied in his mind as he held the trembling paper, beginning to realize that forces were in motion far beyond his comprehension, and that his meeting with the little girl had been no coincidence. In Hope's Crossing, Jasmine watched Iris's house from the window. her large eyes shining with a satisfaction mixed with sadness. She knew the adults would soon discover the truth about many things, but there were secrets only she knew, secrets that could change everything if revealed at the right time. And that time was coming. The Monday meeting with Robert Miles had been just the beginning of a week that would change Thomas's life forever. The documents the lawyer managed to gather in record time confirmed the worst suspicions. Bernard was not only embezzling money from the company, but was also involved in a corruption network that extended from fraudulent school lunch contracts to the illegal sale of hospital medical equipment. But it was on Thursday that Thomas received the call that made his world completely fall apart. Dr. Charles Rivers, director of the private clinic where he had transferred Constance, had a tense voice on the phone. "Mr. Nelson, I need you to come here immediately. Mrs. Santos is urgently asking to speak with you. She says she remembered something very important about your daughter." "My daughter?" Thomas almost dropped the phone. "What do you mean, my daughter? It's better if you come in person. And bring your lawyer if you can." The drive to the clinic felt eternal. Robert had managed to free himself up and accompanied him, noticing the growing tension on his friend's face. When they arrived at Constance's room, she was visibly better, but there was an urgency in her eyes that made Thomas brace for the worst. "Mr. Nelson," she began as soon as he sat down, "I need to tell you the truth about why I left the company. It wasn't just because of Mr. Campbell's corruption." "Go on," Thomas said, his voice sounding strange even to himself. "I worked as a nurse at St. Francis Hospital before I came to your company, remember? That's where I met your daughter, Sophie. When she was admitted after the accident, Thomas's world seemed to stop. You met Sophie. I was her nurse for the 3 days she was hospitalized before." Constance paused, seeing the pain on Thomas's face. "Before she passed. She was a very special girl, Mr. Nelson. Very smart, very brave." "Why did you never tell me this when you came to work at the company?" "Because Mr. Campbell forbade me. He said it would be harmful for you to know I was there that night." Constance took a deep breath before continuing. "But there's something you need to know about Sophie's accident." Robert leaned forward, his legal instincts on high alert. "Mrs. Santos, what exactly do you mean?" "Sophie's car didn't have a mechanical problem like the report said. I overheard Mr. Campbell talking to someone on the phone, thinking no one was around. He said that it had worked perfectly and that the mechanic had done a good job on the brakes." Thomas's blood ran cold. "Are you saying that?" "I'm saying Mr. Campbell sabotaged your ex-wife's car, Mr. Nelson. And when I started working at your company 2 years later, he found out who I was. He kept me close to watch me, to make sure I'd never say anything." The room fell into absolute silence for several seconds. Robert was the first to recover from the shock. "Mrs. Santos, are you certain of what you're saying? This is a very serious accusation." "I'm certain. And there's more." Constance looked directly at Thomas. "Sophie left something for you before she passed. A letter she wrote at the hospital. I promised to deliver it, but Mr. Campbell took it from me when he found out I had it." "Where is this letter?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Jasmine has it. I gave it to her before I was hospitalized. Told her it was something very important from her father." "Her father?" Robert frowned. "Constance, whose daughter is Jasmine?" "Mr. Nelson's," Constance said simply. "Jasmine is Sophie's sister." Thomas's world completely collapsed. "That's impossible. I never—" "You had a brief relationship with my younger sister Joanna 5 years ago. She worked at the diner near your company, remember? You met a few times during your divorce proceedings." The memories came back like an avalanche. Joanna, the kind waitress who comforted him when he was going through the worst time of his life. A few dates, a few nights of comfort amid the emotional chaos of the divorce. She had disappeared suddenly, and he had never thought of her again. Joanna died in childbirth, Constance continued, tears streaming down her face. She asked me to take care of Jasmine, but she never told me who the father was. She just gave me a photo of you with Sophie and said that one day Jasmine should know her real family. The photo, Thomas whispered. Jasmine gave me a photo of me with Sophie. She's very smart, Mr. Nelson. When I got sick and it became clear I couldn't care for her anymore, I told her. The truth, I told her who her father was and why it was important to find him. Constance smiled through her tears. That's why she sought you out. It wasn't a coincidence. She knew exactly where to find you and how to make you pay attention to her. Robert stood up, processing all the information. Thomas, this changes everything. If Bernard really sabotaged the car, he's responsible for Sophie's death. And if Jasmine is your daughter, I have to find her, Thomas said, standing up abruptly. I have to find my daughter. She's safe, said a voice from the door. Everyone turned to see Iris entering the room, holding the hand of a small girl with curly hair and enormous eyes. Jasmine! Constance tried to sit up, her eyes shining with happiness. The little girl ran to the bed and hugged Constance tightly, but her eyes remained fixed on Thomas. Slowly, she took a crumpled envelope from her t-shirt pocket and held it out to him. Sophie wanted you to have this, Daddy, she said simply. With trembling hands, Thomas opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in a childish hand, but clearly crafted with great care. Daddy, if you're reading this, it's because I won't be there to talk to you anymore. Nurse Constance promised she would deliver this letter when the time was right. I love you so much, Daddy. I know you and Mommy are sad, but I don't want you to be alone forever. One day you'll have another family to love, and I want you to know that it's okay. Take good care of them for me. Kisses, Sophie. The tears Thomas had suppressed for 3 years finally came. He knelt in front of Jasmine, who watched him with the same serious, wise expression. He had seen on that first day. You knew who I was from the beginning, didn't you? He asked. Jasmine nodded. Aunt Constance showed me pictures of you and Sophie. She said you were my daddy, but that you were too sad to meet me yet. She touched his face gently. But I knew that if I helped you save someone, you would remember how good it feels to take care of people again. Iris, who had watched the scene in silence, approached. Thomas, Jasmine showed up at my house yesterday. She told me the whole story. I brought her here because I knew you all needed to meet. In the months that followed, everyone's life changed drastically. Bernard was arrested and tried for both the sabotage that caused Sophie's death and the corruption schemes. The company underwent a complete restructuring, with Thomas taking full control and implementing transparent practices. Constance recovered completely with proper treatment and returned to work as a nurse, this time at a clinic Thomas funded in Hope's Crossing. Iris overcame her trauma and became the principal of a new school the company helped build in her neighborhood. But the biggest change was in Thomas. The cold, distrustful man who had isolated himself after losing Sophie discovered that there was still room in his heart for a new family. Jasmine not only brought back his ability to love, but also taught him that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest challenges. 8 months after that day in front of the abandoned building, Thomas officially adopted Jasmine and married Iris in a simple ceremony at the downtown Laurel Creek Church. The girl who had lost her biological mother at birth finally had a complete family, and the man who thought he had lost everything discovered that sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to truly find yourself. On their wedding night, as Jasmine slept in his lap, Thomas looked at the photo of Sophie that now sat on the living room shelf. He knew his first daughter would be happy to see that he had found his way back to love, guided by the unlikely wisdom of a 4-year-old girl who understood broken hearts more than any adult should have to. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Please comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.